Let's be honest about something most people misunderstand about attraction. It rarely begins with looks, and it almost never begins with effort. It begins in the mind of the other person, specifically in how they interpret your presence before you even try to impress them. When a man walks into a room and immediately seeks validation, it shows up in subtle ways. The rushed speech, the slightly forced smile, the need to fill every silence, the constant checking of how he is being perceived, and whether people consciously recognize it or not, it creates an impression of instability, not weakness in the dramatic sense, but a lack of internal grounding. And psychologically, instability does not create attraction, it creates distance. Now contrast that with a man who is simply present. Not performing, not competing, not mentally running ahead trying to figure out how to be liked. He speaks when there is something worth saying, and he is equally comfortable with silence. He doesn't rush to fix how he is being perceived because he is not negotiating his worth in real time. That energy alone changes everything. This is where the first shift happens in understanding instant attraction. It is not about doing more. It is about removing the urgency to be chosen, because urgency communicates need, and need places you in a lower emotional position. And when someone senses that, even unconsciously, attraction becomes complicated, not because people are cruel, but because the human mind is designed to respond to emotional strength with curiosity, and to emotional dependency with caution. Calm confidence, on the other hand, does something very different. It creates space, and in that space, curiosity naturally forms. When you are not trying to control the outcome of every interaction, you stop limiting how the other person experiences you. They begin to project, to wonder, to interpret, and that mental engagement is where attraction quietly begins to grow. This is why over-explaining yourself is so destructive to attraction. Every time you over-explain, you are essentially trying to manage perception. You are saying, please understand me exactly as I want to be understood. But attraction doesn't grow in controlled environments. It grows in psychological freedom, where the other person is allowed to form their own conclusions. A calm man does not rush to fill every gap in understanding. He allows people to sit with him, observe him, and interpret him. That does not mean being emotionally distant. It means being internally anchored. You are present, but not desperate to be decoded immediately. There is also something deeper happening here on a psychological level. When a man is not chasing approval, he unconsciously communicates a belief, I am already enough as I am. And whether she agrees with it or not, that belief is felt. And people are drawn to certainty more than they are drawn to perfection. This is where presence becomes more powerful than words, because presence is not something you fake. It is either rooted in your internal state, or it collapses under pressure. You can't rehearse it. You can't copy it. You can only embody it. That is why the most attractive men in any environment are not always the loudest or the most expressive. They are often the ones who are fully there without trying to dominate the room. They listen without anxiety. They respond without hesitation. They exist without apology. And here is the deeper truth most people miss. Calm confidence is not about being unaffected. It is about being unshaken. You still feel, you still engage, but you are not controlled by the need to be approved in every moment. When you reach that state, something shifts in how people respond to you. Conversations slow down. Eye contact becomes more meaningful. Even small interactions carry weight because they are not contaminated by neediness or pressure. And this is where attraction starts to feel instant. Even though it is actually psychological alignment, she is not reacting to what you are doing. She is reacting to the emotional stability you are projecting. Because stability feels rare, and what feels rare becomes valuable in the human mind. So the real shift is not learning how to impress. It is learning how to stop abandoning yourself in social moments. The less you chase approval, the more naturally you occupy a space that others respond to. And once that foundation is set, everything else in attraction becomes an extension of it, not a performance, but a reflection. Because in the end, people don't resist confidence, they resist uncertainty in themselves. And when they meet someone who is already steady within, they don't just notice it, they feel pulled toward it without fully understanding why. That is where real attraction begins, not in effort, but in presence that doesn't ask to be accepted, it simply exists, and lets the world adjust around it. And the moment you stop trying to be chosen is often the moment you become undeniable. If you look closely at what actually dissolves attraction in its early stages, it is rarely rejection, distance, or even conflict. It is familiarity too soon. The moment a person feels like they have fully mapped you, your thoughts, your reactions, your emotional patterns, their curiosity begins to fade. And once curiosity fades, emotional momentum slows down. This is where emotional mystery becomes one of the most misunderstood but powerful dynamics in attraction. Most men assume that being open means being constantly available, constantly expressive, constantly accessible. But psychologically, overavailability removes contrast, and without contrast, there is no tension. Without tension, there is no pull. Attraction doesn't grow in full exposure, it grows in layers. When a man has no separation between his inner world and what he shares immediately, he unintentionally removes depth from how he is perceived. Not because he is saying the wrong things, but because he is offering everything too early. The mind is wired to explore what it cannot fully see at once. If everything is visible on the surface, there is nothing left for the imagination to work with, and imagination is a critical driver of attraction. A man who understands emotional mystery is not hiding who he is pacing access to who he is. There is a difference. Hiding creates distrust, pacing creates anticipation. One is rooted in insecurity, the other is rooted in control of emotional timing. When you meet someone who has structure in their emotional expression, who doesn't rush to explain every feeling, who doesn't immediately disclose every thought, who doesn't overjustify their reactions, you begin to experience them differently. There is space between interactions, and in that space, your mind starts working. You start wondering, you start filling gaps with curiosity rather than certainty. That curiosity is where attraction quietly develops, because the human mind is not drawn to what is completely known. It is drawn to what feels partially revealed. That almost there feeling is more powerful than full access. It keeps engagement alive. It keeps emotional energy moving. But here is where most people misunderstand mystery. They confuse it with emotional coldness. Mystery is not absence. It is intentional presence without overexposure. You are still emotionally available, but not emotionally predictable in a way that removes depth. You share, but you do not overshare. You connect, but you do not collapse your entire internal world into the interaction. This balance is what creates emotional weight. When a man becomes too available, something subtle happens in the other person's perception. The interaction stops feeling earned. It becomes expected, and what becomes expected slowly loses value in emotional terms. Not because the person is less important, but because the psychological effort required to engage with them decreases. Effort, in emotional psychology, is closely tied to value perception. A man with his own direction, his own focus, his own internal life naturally creates emotional contrast. He is not constantly inserting himself into every moment of interaction. He is not always initiating emotional intensity. He enters, he engages, and he also steps back into his own world without anxiety. And that absence is not distance, it is structure. That structure is what creates intrigue, because now the mind of the other person is not receiving a constant stream of predictable emotional input. Instead, they are experiencing rhythm, presence and absence, expression and restraint, engagement and independence. That rhythm is what keeps emotional interest alive. There is also a deeper psychological layer here. When someone cannot fully predict your emotional responses, their mind stays alert, not in fear, but in attention. And attention is the first stage of emotional attachment. We bond with what we consistently pay attention to, especially when it requires interpretation. A man who is emotionally overavailable removes that interpretive space. Everything is explained, everything is immediate. Nothing is left unresolved, and emotionally, resolution too early feels like closure too soon. Mystery delays closure, and delay sustains interest. But again, this is not about playing games or artificially withholding yourself. It is about having a life that is larger than the interaction itself. When your identity is not centered around constant emotional disclosure, your presence naturally becomes more layered. You don't need to force mystery. You simply stop collapsing your entire internal state into every moment. And that changes how you are experienced. People begin to feel that there is more to you than what is immediately accessible. They sense depth without needing full explanation, and that sense alone creates emotional pull, because the mind is always trying to complete incomplete pictures. It wants to understand, it wants to connect dots, and when you give just enough but not everything, you activate that internal process in others. That is where emotional engagement becomes self-sustaining. So the real shift is not becoming distant. It is becoming structured in your emotional presence. You show up fully, but you do not overextend yourself into immediate transparency. You allow moments to breathe. You allow space for interpretation. You allow your presence to be experienced in layers rather than in a single exposure. And in that layered experience, something very natural happens. Curiosity deepens into attention deepens into emotional investment, and emotional investment slowly turns into attraction. That feels organic rather than forced. Because in the end, people don't fall for what is fully given to them in a single moment. They fall for what continues to reveal itself over time. And the moment you stop giving everything too soon is often the moment you become unforgettable. If you observe relationships and attraction dynamics closely, you start noticing something most people completely overlook. It is rarely the loudest voice in the room that creates direction. It is the one who sets emotional rhythm without needing to announce it. That is what subtle leadership really is: not control, not dominance, but quiet influence in how interactions naturally unfold. Most men misunderstand leadership in attraction. They think it is about being commanding, overly assertive, or constantly making decisions for the other person. But real psychological leadership operates on a much softer and deeper level. It is not about forcing direction. It is about embodying clarity so consistently that others naturally align with you without feeling pushed. When a man is uncertain, reactive, or constantly asking for validation in small decisions, the emotional frame becomes unstable. And instability creates confusion. Confusion does not generate attraction, it generates hesitation. But when a man is grounded in his tone, his timing, and his presence, something subtle shifts in how he is experienced. People begin to relax around him, not because he is controlling them, but because he is not internally scattered. This is where energy becomes more important than words. You can say very little and still lead an interaction if your internal state is steady. Conversely, you can say all the right things and still create no direction if your energy is uncertain. Because people don't just respond to language, they respond to emotional signals beneath language. Subtle leadership shows itself in simple moments. Choosing a direction without over-debating it. allowing pauses in conversation without rushing to fill them, setting a tone of calm instead of matching chaos. Even something as basic as not over-adjusting your behavior based on every micro reaction from the other person communicates internal stability. And stability is deeply attractive because it reduces psychological load. When someone feels your presence is consistent, they don't feel the need to overanalyze or constantly recalibrate themselves. They can simply exist in the interaction, and that ease becomes associated with your presence. But there is a deeper layer to this. Leadership in attraction is not about making the other person follow you. It is about creating a frame where following you feels natural, not forced. That only happens when your actions are not driven by fear of rejection or desire for approval. Because the moment your decisions are emotionally dependent on the other person's reaction, you stop leading and start reacting. And reactive energy always feels unstable. A man who leads subtly does not over-explain his choices. He does not constantly seek agreement for every small step. He simply moves with clarity and allows others to adjust. And this adjustment is not resistance, it is alignment. People naturally sync with clarity when it is consistent. There is also something psychologically powerful about not overreacting to tests or emotional fluctuations. In any dynamic, especially early attraction, there will be moments where the other person unconsciously tests your stability. Not in a calculated way, but through shifts in tone, attention, or emotional distance. A reactive man amplifies those moments. A grounded man neutralizes them, and neutrality is powerful because it communicates that your emotional state is not easily disrupted. That does not mean you are detached or indifferent. It means you are anchored, you are engaged, but not controlled by external fluctuations. And that anchoring creates a sense of safety mixed with intrigue. Safety alone creates comfort. Intrigue alone creates instability. But when both coexist, attraction becomes far more powerful. She feels emotionally secure around you, but still curious about you. That combination is rare, and rarity is what deepens emotional attachment. Subtle leadership also means understanding timing, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, knowing when to move the interaction forward and when to let it breathe. Most people destroy attraction not because of what they do, but because of timing misalignment, too much too soon, or too little when presence is needed. When your timing becomes intentional, your presence starts to feel more grounded. You are not rushing emotional outcomes. You are not trying to accelerate connection unnaturally. You are allowing it to develop at a pace that feels stable rather than forced. And that patience is often misread as confidence, because in a world where most people are trying to prove themselves quickly, the one who is not rushing stands out. But the most important aspect of subtle leadership is internal non-negotiation. You are not shifting your identity, your tone, or your direction just to maintain attention. You are not bending your internal frame every time there is uncertainty. You remain steady even when the interaction shifts. And that steadiness becomes the emotional anchor in the dynamic. Over time, people don't remember the exact words you said. They remember how it felt to be around your presence, whether they felt guided or confused, whether they felt calm or unsettled, whether they felt like they could relax or constantly had to interpret. That is the real imprint of leadership in attraction. Not control, not performance, but emotional direction that others naturally lean into because it feels clear, stable, and grounded. And when a man reaches that level of presence, he stops chasing outcomes altogether, because he is no longer trying to create attraction through effort. He is allowing attraction to form through alignment. And that is the final shift most people never realize. When your energy becomes the direction, you no longer need to force anything. People begin to move toward you without fully understanding why. And in that silence of explanation, attraction becomes undeniable.